Today we're at the Carp Society Farriers Lake in the Cotswolds, and we're joining Kev Hewitt to talk about the incredible hit of big fish he had on a recent session. So Kev, setting the scene for us a little bit, I know on the previous trip you'd had a couple of 40s, so you must have been feeling pretty confident.
Yeah, I'd had a really good year up until then, but I hadn't got in amongst those big 40s at all. I hadn't had any 40s for the year, and there's a few in here. So on that particular trip, it was about a month ago now, I kicked it off with one in the night. It was a fish called Chili's fish, which was 46 pound 10 ounce, which was a PB common for me at the time. And then first thing in the morning, I had another big un on the bounce of 45 pound 10. So I've had two big uns on the bounce, and that ended that trip nicely. And yeah, of course, it was my favourite time of year. It was coming into autumn and it was big fish time of year. So yeah, confidence was up.
You obviously managed to get onto some fish. Had you mentioned that throughout the year you've been catching plenty, but mainly the smaller ones, say smaller, still 30 pound, it's still big fish, but you hadn't got amongst the 40s. Had you changed anything on that trip in terms of your bait or your presentation, or do you think you just got a bit lucky?
I think as the year goes on, when you come into autumn, for me, if I'm catching, that's when 90% of the time I always catch a lot of my bigger fish. But there was a few things I had changed. When it comes into autumn, I do slightly change my baiting approach, and I'd incorporated one extra thing, and that was bloodworm, so frozen bloodworm. That's something that I always use, or I have been using quite a lot in recent years. Back end of the year, when it gets to the end of September, coming into October, it's something I incorporate into my mix, and is sort of helped me catch quite a lot of big fish over the last few years at that time of year.
Yeah, I could see that being a big edge because there's probably not many people doing it. But you're obviously fishing accurately to sort of small spots or spots within spots. When you got down for the recent session, when you had the big hit, was it busy? Did you manage to get where you wanted to be? Did you manage to well, you obviously got on fish, but were you feeling confident from the start?
Yeah, I was fairly confident. I knew where the fish had been holding out. Basically, they're up one end of the lake and they're out in the middle of one end of the lake. And I'd set up in a swim. I'd never fished it before, to be honest, but I'd been catching quite a few fish from opposite. So I knew I was in the same sort of area. And the swim I moved into, it had done two fish in the last couple of days in the build up to my trip. So I knew it had done bites. I knew that a lot of the bait had been eaten. So when I was moving into the swim, I knew that a couple of fish had come off of it, and I knew they were there. So I knew I was going to be on the fish, and yeah, the rest is history.
So as a result, the area had been fed on, the bait had probably all gone. Did you bait fairly aggressively to start with?
No, I found normally I would, like when I'm up at bluebell or linear, I do put quite a bit of bait in quite a lot of the time if I know that they're going to have it or feel that they're going to have it. But on farriers it's been a little bit different. I found if I put too much bait in, it has the opposite effect in here. Now I think it's because it's really shallow, so the spots I'm fishing quite often are between 3 and 4 foot deep, and I just feel that carp don't seem to want to feed on big beds of bait on that shallow water. So I put a lot less than I normally would. So maybe a dozen spombs just to sort of kick-start the swim. And then whenever I get a bite, I just top up with sometimes 3 or 4 spombs. So a lot less than what I normally would.
Right, so you got here on was it the Sunday evening?
Sunday morning.
Sunday
I got
morning.
down. Yeah, I got into the swim. The chap was packing up at 10 o'clock. So I got in the swim at 10 o'clock on the Sunday morning.
So you baited fairly lightly. When did you have your first bite?
The first bite, so I got the rods out for about 11 o'clock. I had the first bite at 5 o'clock in the evening. So the lad in here, in there before me, had a bite the previous evening at 5 o'clock. So it was a good sort of bite time, and I've had one, and with a bit of luck, that just turned out to be a 43 pounder, first bite of the trip, and I've got a big one, and it was almost like I felt satisfied that was it for the trip, I'm happy, I've had a big one, and anything else was going to be a bonus from there on in.
So on here, when have you generally found the bite times? Obviously it changes through the year, generally going into the autumn it starts to be more night bites. How did that progress through the session? To
be fair, because it's quite shallow, it's very different to a lot of lakes I fished on farriers, and bite time can be any time. Night times are less productive. the mornings are really good, but there are times where afternoon bites and evening bites are achievable, and generally it really can rip off at any time on here, and that's one thing I really love about the venue, because you know, a lot of vet places you get to 11 in the morning, you may as well wind in till the next morning, you're waiting for that period, but on here it can go at any time.
So you're well known for favouring the Ronnie rig for a lot of your fishing, and I know you've been doing that a lot on here. How have you tweaked anything or made any changes to it?
I've kept the principles pretty much the same on the Ronnie rig for a number of years that I've been using it, but this year I've incorporated a new quick clip, which I believe it was your idea. You sent me a sample earlier in the year, probably February if I remember right. Love the idea and the concept of it straight away. I'll make no bones about it, I'm fairly lazy-ish when it comes to rig, to an extent. Don't get me wrong, I won't chuck out any old bit of rubbish. I'll still chuck out the best rig that I could possibly tie, but I absolutely hate tying rigs. So anything to make my life easier for changing a rig or tying a rig, then I'm all for it. So the little quick clip with the little sleeve over it that you sort of developed and sent me earlier in the year, absolutely fantastic, love it. I can land a fish, if I need to change a rig, I can just literally unhook it, put a new rig on and bang it straight back out there once I put the fish back. But the main thing is I can tie loads of just the Ronnie rig sections, and I don't have to tie loads of booms all the time, which is what I was doing before, you know, so it's one less component I have to sort of change, and I can always just use the same boom.
Yeah, it survives quite well, doesn't it, the tungsten loaded, even after you caught a few on the same boom.
Yeah, definitely. You can get a good few sessions out of just one boom section, so it saves a little bit of money in tungsten loaded material, and it just, you know, you can just change your rig quicker and don't have to sit there tying loads of rigs up throughout a session.
I suppose with the Ronnie rig, it lends itself to that quick change aspect, doesn't it? Like seeing your rig wallet, you've got loads of the hook sections already tied up. But it's obviously got to be an effective rig as well. It's not just the convenience factor, is it? And what are you finding that your hook holds are like? You know, you've caught 7 40s in that session, 12 fish in total. Were the hook holds consistently good? I know it's a weedy lake, so you've obviously got them out. Yeah,
so it's a very weedy lake, and it's barbless hooks. So most people kind of think that's a nightmare. But to be honest, where I've used the curve shanks hooks in a size 6, I've been using them for ever since they come out, which is a few years now, and I've had some incredible runs. I went last year and the year before, I went a year and a half, over 100 bites without losing one to a hook pull. So I've got, and that's on a barbless hook. So I've got utmost confidence in the hook pattern, and obviously that's continued. I have lost a couple since, you know, I'm not going to lie, I've had a couple of hook pulls. It's only nature that you are going to lose a couple. At some point it was always going to happen. But yeah, the hook holds are fantastic. You know, you're unhooking them and you just know you're never ever going to have lost that fish.
Yeah, absolutely nailed generally, aren't they? So getting back to this sort of red letter session, I'd imagine it's probably still sort of sinking in at the moment, but tell us a little bit. So on the second day, how did things progress through that day? I mean, you obviously kept topping up the swim with bait, I would imagine, or was it little and often?
Yeah,
or?
not really. So I tend to put out some bait in the evening, whether I've had a bite or not. One thing that I've found for me that has been absolutely deadly, and it's worked every single morning on farriers pretty much throughout the last couple of months, is at first light just putting a top up of my mix, but with more bloodworm in there. So a good like scoop of bloodworm in with the mix, but just putting 2 or 3 spods out. And the way I see it is it's quite shallow and the bloodworm just clouds the water. And honestly, the amount of bites I had quick after doing that was unbelievable. As I said, pretty much every morning I had a bite within an hour. A number of times I was having a bite within 10 minutes. So nothing all night, not a bite. Put 3 spons out in the morning with this cloudy bloodworm mix and having a bite within 10 minutes. And at first I thought it was, you know, well, it's just a little bit of a fluke. But doing it every morning, it's soon become apparent that actually this is making a massive difference here. Don't get me wrong, I feel I would have got a bite at some point in the morning anyway, but for whatever reason, that bloodworm seems to get them there straight away, get their attention and get them dropping down and feeding. So I wasn't topping up all the time, but whenever I had a bite, I was just putting a few more spods out, you know. So maybe sometimes I was just putting 3 spods out if I felt there was a quick bite after. And then when, you know, if I felt that a lot of the bait had gone, then sometimes I put up to 10 spods out. So I kind of change it throughout the session and just always trying to keep the bait going in, but that's dictated by when you get the bites. So I get a bite, then I'll put some bait out. I'll get a bite, then I'll put some bait out.
And you're obviously generating that competition out there. You've got numbers of fish in the swim.
Yeah.
And that bloodworm's obviously really sort of flicking their buttons, isn't it? It's like really getting them going. So
without a doubt, there was no coincidence in my mind that it, you know, when I was putting that in, I was getting a bite pretty quick at times, particularly in the morning. So don't get me wrong, if it's dead and they're not feeding, I'm not just going to hammer it in and suddenly start getting a load of bites. But when they are in the mood and there's a few fish about, it just seems to trigger them into getting onto the spot and getting their heads down. You know, if I wasn't in that particular swim, then if I was at the opposite end of the lake, I could have put as much bloodworm as I want out. I wouldn't have got a bite because I'm not on fish and I'm not on the right spot. So it's not a magic thing that you can suddenly start using anywhere and start catching. It's just not going to happen. Everything else still has to be right, but it definitely is a, you know, massive edge when you're on the fish and they're there in front of you.
You're not drawing fish, but when you're on fish, it obviously is a massive trigger for them. Yeah,
without a doubt.
So you've been basically getting no bite activity at night. It's all in the hours of daylight. So you're getting up in the morning and you're spodding, which a lot of people might think is slightly unusual in terms of spodding at bite time, potentially. But it's obviously the trigger that's getting the bites. But also on a sort of a water like this, you know, you've got quite a number of big fish. It must be so important when you're on them like that to hold them in the swim, because if you don't keep feeding, I guess they're just going to move off.
Yeah, I'd never had a bite at night. It was absolutely dead. And as I said, I get up first thing in the morning. It's something I've been accustomed to. It's something that I'm doing all the time now. Not filling it in the morning, but just 2 or 3 spods over the top just to freshen it up and get that cloud, which gets them feeding. But yeah, you always want a little. I always want bait in my swim on the bottom, so I wouldn't have 2 or 3 bites without topping up, because all the bait will be gone and the fish will move off. So when you do get that bite, yeah, you want to put a little bit more bait out just to keep them there.
And then after you had, well, after you obviously you're getting bites fairly quickly after baiting up in the morning, then what happened the rest of that second day?
So I got up first, like I hadn't had a bite through the night, and I just put out my 3 spods in the morning, and it actually took me 45 minutes to get a bite, which is actually longer than what it had been taking me most mornings. And that one was a big one. It was one called the John Doe fish, which is 46 pounds, just over 46. So barring the fish the previous week, it would have actually been a PB, but obviously I'm over the moon, you know. I've got another big one, second big one of the trip, and I'm rocking. So I put a bit more bait out. I had another 3 smaller ones, like a 30 and a couple of 20s through the day, topped up, and then it went a little bit quiet, you know. So I've just sat back, sat on my hands, and as I mentioned, there'd been a few evening bites in the swim, and I'd seen a bit of fizzing coming out on the bait about 5 o'clock, and I knew there was fish there. And a few started to turn up, so because it's quite shallow, you quite often see them cruising with their backs out the water, and there was a few fish milling about. And what became apparent is every time they cruised past, they stopped on my spot and they dropped down and fed, and you can see the bubbles coming up. So I was almost hovering over the rod, you know. I know that rod's going to go, and it didn't take long, and eventually it did go. And I remember when it hit the surface, his dorsal fin was erect, and it just led there on his side. And I was pulling it, it wasn't really moving. It felt like it was weeded up, and it just really slowly kited the whole way in, and it actually picked up my other rod. And it's the first fish that had done that for ages in here, and it actually got snagged, and the other line pulled into the weed, and it got stuck, and it was about, I don't know, 15 yards out, lead on the top, and I could see this fish was massive. And I got into the chest waders, and luckily I got a twist lock extending landing net handle, because the fish was stuck on the surface, the line was going out back out to the spot, and I couldn't budge it anymore. And I just managed to get his head just into the net, and I'm kind of up to here in my chest waders, and I've lifted it and it's kind of flipped, and luckily it went into the net. It could have quite easily have flipped the other way and gone out of the net. And when I've pulled it in, it just confirmed what I already knew. It was a proper big one. It was a fish called Scar, which has previously done £50 earlier in the year, and onto the scales it was £48.4, so another new PB common for me, and it was massive. It was, what a fish that one was.
Yeah, hell of a fish that, mate. Yeah, so what's that, 2 PB commons in 2 trips?
Yeah. And a 45 and a 46 to back it up as well at this point in time.
So at this point, the evening of the second day of the session, you're at the stage where you've already had a session of a lifetime. You had one more night and the following day, was it? Or the following morning?
That's it, following
So
day.
what happened then?
I got a couple of buckets of water chucked over me in the evening, so I was nice and wet, so I had to sort of go and get changed and everything. It was a new PB. They took great pleasure in chucking a couple of buckets of water over me. I was obviously on cloud nine. The next night followed, just dead, nothing, not a bleep, not a liner. Got up in the morning, done my usual thing, put me 3 spods of cloudy bloodworm mix out there, and this time it literally took me 10 minutes to get a bite, and another 40. And to cut a long story short, topped up, and I had 3 43-pounders on the bounce in an hour and 3/4 that morning. Nice. So I'd already had 3 40s, and then in an hour and 3/4 I had another 3 40s, all over 43 pound.
Well, and you're back down to earth this session, aren't you? You had one yesterday, didn't you?
Yeah, so a few weeks on now, a lot colder.
Weeks on, yeah.
I'm actually back in the same swim again. It died after I fished it. It done a couple of fish after I went home, and then it hasn't done a bite for 2 weeks. But I did manage to get one yesterday morning. Again, same thing. I got up first light, put my 3 spods out. 7 minutes later, I've had the bite, and it was only a small one, a mid-20, but still really welcome fish. But to be fair, it's been absolutely dead, and to get a bite within 7 minutes of spodding when it's dead, it's just unbelievable. You know, it just goes to show that what I'm doing is working. Yeah. But I've kept plugging away, and I've not had a bite since. You know, if I hadn't put those 3 spods out, I could be blanking now. You know. Yeah.
So what are your plans for the rest of the autumn, Kev?
To be honest, mate, I've fished a fair bit the back end of the year. I've pretty much fished every other week for the last couple of months now. So I'm going to spend a bit more time at home, you know, get some brownie points ready for next spring, and just have a bit of a chill out and take a back seat with the fishing for a while.
Brilliant, mate. Well deserved. Thanks very much, Kev.
Yeah, cheers.